Have you ever heard of a legend so drenched in blood that it outlives even the memory of the person herself? A name that drifts through Gothic novels, horror films, and whispered campfire tales, Elizabeth Báthory, the woman the world would come to call the Blood Countess. Born into unimaginable wealth and power in the Kingdom of Hungary, Elizabeth Báthory lived between 1560 and 1614, an age of superstition, political turmoil, and ruthless ambition. She belonged to the powerful Báthory family, cousins of kings and princes, defenders of Christendom against the Ottomans. Her birthright was privilege, status, and influence. Yet history remembers her not for politics, nor for diplomacy, nor even for beauty, but for something far more sinister. According to the tales, Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. They say she tortured servants with unimaginable cruelty, that she transformed her castle into a chamber of horrors. By the time of her arrest in 1610, rumors claimed that more than 600 girls had met their fate within her walls. But pause here with me. Is this legend true? Or is it a story twisted by politics, envy, and the convenient scapegoating of a powerful woman in a man's world? Before we take her guilt for granted, let's peel back the curtain of history. Behind the sensational myths lies a woman born into one of the most tumultuous centuries of European history. And her story begins not with screams in the night, but with the cradle of nobility. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 at Nyírbátor in the Kingdom of Hungary. She was destined to wield influence from the moment she first cried out. Her family tree was laced with rulers, uncles who sat as voivodes of Transylvania, cousins who wore crowns, relatives who commanded armies against the advancing Ottoman Empire. She was not merely a countess, she was part of Europe's elite ruling class, and yet even as a child Elizabeth's life was not untouched by shadows. Accounts suggest she suffered from fits or seizures, what we might today call epilepsy. In an age ruled by superstition, her falling sickness was treated with strange remedies, a drop of blood from a healthy person placed upon the lips of the afflicted. Imagine this, an innocent child learning from an early age that blood strangely had power. Her education was no less remarkable. Elizabeth was fluent in Hungarian, Latin, and German. She studied law, literature, and politics, a rare privilege for a noblewoman of her time. She was as cunning as she was beautiful, described as tall, pale, with striking dark eyes. She learned not just to charm, but to rule. From the very beginning, Elizabeth was no ordinary woman. And in this clash of brilliance and brutality, power and superstition, the seeds of legend were sown. As we step deeper into her story, remember this: legends do not rise from nothing. Whether true or not, something about Elizabeth Báthory terrified her world enough to echo down through centuries. By the age of 11, Elizabeth Báthory was already being groomed for her role in one of Europe's most powerful alliances. In 1575, she was betrothed to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, heir to another wealthy and influential Hungarian noble house. These marriages were never about love. They were about power, strategy, and binding together the fortunes of dynasties. Elizabeth's marriage cemented her position as one of the most formidable women in Central Europe. The Nadasdy family gifted her Chaktica castle, perched on a lonely hilltop, its stone walls destined to become both her home and eventually the setting of her darkest legends. But who was Ferenc Nadasdy, the man who shared her life? He was a soldier above all else. Known as the Black Knight of Hungary, Ferenc was a fierce warrior against the Ottoman Turks. When he was home, he was a devoted husband in his own way, but he was rarely present. War consumed him, and with his absences, Elizabeth assumed the role of ruling the estates. She managed vast lands, commanded hundreds of servants, and oversaw villages and peasants, and it is here in her early years of authority that we begin to see Elizabeth's sharp edge. Records describe her as intelligent, ruthless in business, and intolerant of disobedience. Peasants both respected and feared her. To them, she was a distant mistress, severe but competent. Now, imagine Elizabeth, a noblewoman barely out of her teens, already tasked with controlling a miniature kingdom, while her husband was away spilling blood on the battlefield. The responsibility hardened her. The loneliness deepened her. And perhaps it was here that the whispers of cruelty began to take root. Stories from this period suggest she did not suffer weakness among her servants. Discipline in noble households was harsh by any measure of the time, But Elizabeth's punishments were said to go further. Some servants disappeared without explanation. Others spoke in hushed tones of her temper, of how she demanded obedience with a cold, piercing gaze. Ferenc, for his part, may have fed her darker tendencies. It is said that he shared with Elizabeth cruel methods of disciplining servants, techniques he had perfected on the battlefield. If true, this partnership of power and brutality would become the foundation of her reputation. But while the Nardasti estates were managed with an iron hand, Elizabeth's world was not one of unbroken cruelty. She bore children, and by all accounts she loved them. She wrote letters, many of which survive today, revealing a woman of intelligence and wit, not a monstrous caricature. This contrast is critical. Was Elizabeth truly a sadistic noblewoman, or was she a victim of later propaganda? Already we see a duality forming. Just as peasants might have feared her, others respected her as a capable ruler and mother. Still, history is rarely kind to women in power, and Elizabeth Báthory's story was already leaning toward shadow. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth was left not just a widow, but the undisputed ruler of her estates. And with his death, the most infamous chapters of her life, the accusations, the horrors, and the legends, would soon begin. In 1604, Count Ferenc Nádasdy, the famed Black Knight of Hungary, was dead. Elizabeth Báthory, only 44 years old, found herself a widow, alone, powerful, and vulnerable all at once. With her husband gone, the full weight of the Nádasdy fortune, estates, and authority fell squarely upon her shoulders. To some, this should have been the height of her power. Elizabeth was already a figure of immense influence. She commanded wealth, owned vast lands, and had 4 children. In a world where women were often footnotes to their husbands' legacies, she was the exception. She was the legacy. But history shows us that when power meets suspicion, the whispers are never far behind. And for Elizabeth, those whispers were about to grow into screams. As the widow of Choctaw Castle, Elizabeth was free to govern as she wished. No husband to overshadow her, no warrior count to temper her decisions. And soon stories began to spread. Servants vanished. Young girls who had been brought to the castle never returned. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of mysterious carriages arriving at night, and screams echoing from the stone walls. At first, these were rumors, easy to dismiss as the gossip of peasants envious of their noble mistress. But the pattern was too consistent, too persistent. The peasantry began to see Elizabeth not just as a stern lady, but as something darker. The legends say that Elizabeth began luring young girls into her service with promises of work, only to subject them to brutal punishments behind closed doors. Some accounts describe her as inflicting tortures so sadistic they are difficult even to repeat. Beatings, burnings, and cruel experiments that blurred the line between discipline and sadism. And then, of course, came the most infamous claim of all, that Elizabeth Báthory bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. But let us pause here, because as historians we must ask, did this truly happen, or is it a creation of her enemies? The accusation of blood bathing would not appear until much later in the retellings of her crimes. What we do know is that young women, peasant girls, and later even daughters of the nobility, were disappearing within her domain. And whether or not she bathed in their blood, something sinister was unfolding in the dark corridors of Choctaw Castle. Her servants became both accomplices and witnesses. Some claimed they helped lure victims, others that they were forced to join in the punishments. And when questioned years later, their testimonies painted a chilling portrait of the widow countess. But here is the paradox. Elizabeth continued to maintain her public role as a noblewoman. She attended functions, wrote letters, oversaw her estates with intelligence and efficiency. On paper, she was both respected and feared. In shadow, she was becoming something else entirely. The walls of Choctaw Castle grew heavier with secrets, and as whispers reached higher into the ranks of Hungary's nobility, Elizabeth's enemies began to take notice. They saw not only her cruelty, but also an opportunity. Her story was no longer confined to the peasants. Now the crown itself was listening. By the first decade of the 17th century, Elizabeth Báthory's reputation was no longer contained within the villages around Choctaw Castle. Whispers had crept into the parlors of nobility, into the pews of the church, and into the halls of royal courts. The stories all sounded the same. Young girls arriving for service and never leaving. Mothers pleaded at the gates of the castle, demanding to know what had become of their daughters. The guards offered silence or worse, a cold laugh. And behind those thick stone walls, screams were said to pierce the night. At first, the nobility dismissed such tales. After all, Elizabeth Báthory was no ordinary woman. She was cousin to the Prince of Transylvania. She belonged to one of the most powerful families in all of Hungary. To accuse her was to risk everything. But then the victims began to change. Peasant girls were expendable in the eyes of the elite. Tragic, yes, but not enough to shake the pillars of society. Yet when noble daughters began to disappear, the whispers sharpened into accusations. This was no longer a matter of rumor. It was becoming a political crisis. The clergy took notice as well. Local priests, when conducting funerals or speaking with grieving families, began to hear the same story repeated. Elizabeth's castle was a place of terror. Some priests dared to speak out in sermons, warning that her cruelty was an affront to God. Others, fearful of her power, chose silence. Still, the rumors spread. They spoke of Elizabeth's insatiable cruelty, that she delighted in striking her servants until blood ran, that she experimented with torture devices of her own invention, and that her hunger for suffering was not merely punishment, but something darker, something ritualistic. And then came the most damning whisper of all, that the Countess had discovered a terrible secret, that she had bathed in the blood of maidens to preserve her youth. Was it true? Or was it an invention, a metaphor twisted into legend? We may never know. But to her enemies, truth didn't matter. What mattered was perception, and perception was beginning to turn against Elizabeth Báthory. At court, King Matthias II heard the stories with mounting unease. On one hand, Elizabeth was nobility, and noble blood was shielded by privilege. On the other, if the rumors were true, then not even her rank could excuse such monstrous acts. There was another motive as well: debt. Elizabeth owed the king vast sums of money. If she were convicted of heinous crimes, her fortune could be seized, her lands redistributed, her debts erased. And so, political opportunity met moral outrage. Whispers turned into petitions. Priests demanded justice. Nobles whispered that something had to be done. The net was closing, but Elizabeth was not unaware. She sensed the tightening of power around her, and in response, she grew bolder, more reckless, as though daring her enemies to act. What happened next would seal her fate. By 1610, the patience of King Matthias II had worn thin. For years, rumors of Elizabeth Báthory's cruelty had circled his court. At first, they were dismissed as jealous gossip, tales of an eccentric, powerful woman twisted into grotesque caricatures. But now the testimonies had multiplied, becoming too consistent, too widespread to ignore. The king saw an opportunity. Elizabeth owed him a staggering debt, one she had never repaid. By moving against her, he could satisfy both political necessity and financial gain. Justice, perhaps, but justice tinged with calculation. He entrusted the task to one man, Count György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary. Thurzó was no ordinary investigator. He was a high noble, a trusted ally of the king, and a man who knew how to balance truth with politics. His mission was clear: investigate Elizabeth Báthory, gather evidence, and if the accusations proved true, bring her reign of terror to an end. Thurzó began quietly. He traveled the villages surrounding Choctaw Castle, speaking with peasants, priests, and survivors. What he heard chilled him. Stories of girls lured by promises of work and never returning, mothers weeping as they described the last time they saw their daughters alive, servants whispering of screams echoing through the halls at night. But most damning were the testimonies of Elizabeth's own accomplices. Several of her servants, questioned under oath, described the Countess's cruelty in harrowing detail. They spoke of punishments that grew ever more elaborate, ever more sadistic, as though fueled by an endless hunger. Thurzó documented everything, carefully weaving rumor with testimony, suspicion with fact. With every piece of evidence, the case grew stronger. Yet even then there was hesitation. To accuse a Báthory was no small matter. She was the widow of a powerful warlord, the cousin of the Prince of Transylvania, and the head of vast estates. But the tide had turned. With noble families now pressing the king and priests calling for justice, even Elizabeth's rank could not shield her. So, Thurzo acted. On the cold night of December 30th, 1610, he rode to Chaktiche Castle with a small band of soldiers. The village below was silent, but the people watched from their windows, holding their breath. The Countess had ruled through fear for decades. Was this the night it ended? When Thurzo entered the castle, what he found would become the stuff of legend. Some accounts say he discovered girls imprisoned, their bodies scarred, some dead, others barely alive. Others claim this was exaggerated, a myth woven by later storytellers to blacken her name. But what mattered most was perception, and Thurzo had enough. He declared Elizabeth Báthory arrested, confining her within her own castle walls. Her accomplices, those who had aided her, were taken away in chains. For the first time, the Blood Countess was trapped. But what punishment could possibly fit her crimes? Death, trial, or something far stranger? Justice twisted by politics and power. In January 1611, the trials began. Not Elizabeth herself, not yet, but her closest servants and accomplices. For if the Countess was the hand that commanded cruelty, these were the hands that carried it out. 4 stood accused: Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Jo, Janos Uvari, and Katarina Benica. They had served Elizabeth faithfully, some for years, obeying her orders without question. But now, under oath and under pressure, they faced the judgment of the realm. The courtroom was tense, a mixture of nobles, clergy, and peasants eager for justice. Witnesses came forward, voices trembling as they recounted what they had seen or what they believed had happened. Peasant mothers spoke of daughters who had vanished after being lured to Chaktiche Castle. Servants whispered of nights filled with screams. Priests testified that confessions had been heard on deathbeds, describing horrors inside the fortress. And then came the servants' own words. Whether under the weight of guilt or the threat of torture, they confessed to acts that shocked even seasoned judges. They described punishments so cruel, methods of torment so grotesque that the courtroom gasped. Some whispered prayers, others crossed themselves. They spoke of Elizabeth's temper, how she would fly into rages, striking, clawing, biting until blood was drawn. They claimed she believed blood was the essence of youth, that she sought it as others sought wine. They told stories of chambers where girls were beaten, mutilated, left to die. Were these confessions truth, or desperate inventions to satisfy their accusers and save themselves from worse fates? History cannot say with certainty. But in that courtroom, in that moment, the effect was undeniable. The legend of Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, was cemented. The verdict came swiftly. Dorothea, Ilona, and Janos were sentenced to death, executed with brutality meant to reflect the cruelty of their crimes. Katarina, younger and considered less culpable, was spared execution but condemned to life imprisonment. And what of Elizabeth? She remained locked in her castle, never allowed to appear in court. Whether this was protection for her noble rank or a calculated move by the king to avoid scandal, the result was the same. The Countess never stood trial. Her accomplices paid the price, while she waited in silence behind stone walls. But whispers persisted. Some said she demanded to face her accusers but was denied. Others claimed she laughed when told of her servants' executions, and still others believed this entire spectacle was less about justice and more about erasing her power, her wealth and her influence. What is certain is this: by the end of the trial, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer simply a noblewoman. She was a monster in the eyes of Europe, her name synonymous with cruelty. Her deeds whispered in fear, and yet her punishment was not death. No burning at the stake, no public execution. Instead, something far stranger awaited her. Elizabeth Báthory, once the most powerful woman in Hungary, was never brought before a public court. Instead, her punishment was something more chilling, more symbolic, a living entombment. In 1611, King Matthias and the Hungarian authorities decreed that Elizabeth would spend the rest of her life confined within Chaktiche Castle. But this was no ordinary imprisonment. Windows were bricked over, doors sealed. She was locked inside her chambers, left to walk in circles through dark, narrow rooms. Guards slid food through small slits, the only contact she had with the world beyond. Imagine it: stone walls pressing in, no sunlight, no voices except your own. For years she had filled these halls with screams of others. Now the only sound was her own breathing. Some accounts say she wandered restlessly, pacing in the darkness. Others claim she scratched at the walls, leaving marks that outlived her. A few even whispered she continued her rituals in secret, taking servants through hidden doors the guards never knew about. But the truth is harder, simpler, colder. Elizabeth was alone. Her once magnificent castle had become a coffin. Her enemies ensured that she would not die swiftly but slowly, forgotten, stripped of her power, her vanity, her glory. And yet the Countess endured. She lived like this for 3 long years. In her solitude, rumors grew louder outside the walls. Some believed she had gone mad, speaking to shadows as if they were companions. Others claimed she wrote strange letters, filled with ramblings of blood, beauty, and vengeance. None survive today if they ever existed, and still the legend deepened. Peasants whispered that on certain nights, cries could be heard from the castle. Was it the Countess herself, haunted by the ghosts of her victims? Or was it imagination, fueled by fear of the woman they had come to know as a monster? On the night of August 20th, 1614, silence fell permanently. Elizabeth was found lying face down on the floor of her chamber, cold and still. At 54 years old, the Blood Countess had passed into legend. Her body was buried in the church at Chakticha, but the people refused to let her rest there. The grave was desecrated, her remains removed. To this day, no one knows where she lies. Some say she was moved to her family's crypt. Others believe her bones were scattered, denied peace forever. But her story did not die with her body. In fact, death only gave it more power. Elizabeth Báthory, the woman who lived like a queen and died like a prisoner, had become something else, an immortal tale of fear, cruelty, and mystery. When Elizabeth Báthory died in 1614, her body may have vanished into an unmarked grave, but her legend refused to be buried. Instead, it grew, larger, darker, more grotesque with every retelling. The peasants of Upper Hungary had long feared her, but now, with her voice silenced, her enemies painted her legacy in blood. Pamphlets spread through Europe. Woodcut prints depicted her in grotesque caricatures, a noblewoman bathing in tubs of blood, feasting on maidens, presiding over ritual tortures. The truth. These accounts came decades after her death. Most were written by German printers and pamphleteers who thrived on lurid scandal. To them, Elizabeth was not just a condemned noblewoman, she was material. She was a story to sell, a nightmare to whisper at hearthsides, a warning cloaked in horror. And yet there was a seed of truth. Witness testimonies from her trial had been preserved, shaped, and twisted. What had once been the confessions of terrified servants became, in the public imagination, proof of sorcery, vampirism, and unholy vanity. Soon, she was no longer just the Blood Countess. She became a myth, a woman who sought eternal youth through the blood of virgins, a noble who made her castle a slaughterhouse, a predator cloaked in velvet and jewels. But why her? Why did Elizabeth Báthory's story survive when so many others of her time faded into obscurity? Partly it was politics. Her downfall enriched King Matthias, who seized her lands and debts. Painting her as a monster ensured that no one questioned the legitimacy of her ruin, and partly it was timing. The 17th century was a Europe obsessed with witches, with demons, with the fear of women wielding power beyond their station. Elizabeth, with her wealth, her independence, and her alleged cruelty, was the perfect villain for an age terrified of female ambition, and so her name lived on, whispered in courtrooms, monasteries, and taverns. Was she guilty of killing hundreds? Or was she the victim of a smear campaign so effective that it turned her into the most infamous woman in history? The answer lies buried under centuries of ink. But one thing is certain, Elizabeth Báthory had transcended mortality. She was no longer a person. She was a legend. By the 18th century, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer remembered merely as a noblewoman accused of cruelty. She had become something more chilling, more timeless, a figure of the supernatural. The whispers of her bathing in blood, first spread through pamphlets and folk tales, now mingled with Europe's growing obsession with vampires. In Eastern Europe, legends of the Nosferatu already haunted villages, creatures that drank the life from the living, that rose from graves, that blurred the line between man and monster. Elizabeth's story fit neatly into this folklore. writers began to take notice. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars, preachers, and poets recounted her tale with embellishments that made her larger than life. No longer just a cruel noblewoman, she was depicted as a fiend who drank blood to preserve her beauty, a woman who had traded her soul for youth eternal. And then came Gothic literature. In the same century that Bram Stoker gave the world Dracula, Elizabeth's legend was revived in shadowy novels, operas, and plays. Writers painted her as the female vampire, a dark mirror to Stoker's Transylvanian Count. She was seductive yet terrifying, aristocratic yet monstrous, a noblewoman whose hunger was never for power or wealth, but for life itself. Her story inspired works like Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, 1872, one of the first vampire tales to feature a woman as the predator. Though Carmilla was not explicitly Elizabeth, echoes of the Countess can be felt in her immortal hunger. Later, pulp novels and penny dreadfuls in the 19th century depicted Elizabeth outright, naming her as the Blood Countess, the matron of vampiric evil. By the dawn of the 20th century, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer just history. She was myth, legend, archetype. Her face lingered in the imagination of Europe. Half beautiful noblewoman, half monstrous vampire. Even today, films, novels, and television shows resurrect her image. A pale woman in velvet gowns, her hands stained red, her castle filled with shadows and whispers. But here lies the question, was this transformation inevitable? Was Elizabeth truly guilty of unimaginable crimes, or did centuries of storytelling, propaganda, and fear reshape her into something she never was? The truth may be lost, but her legend lives on immortal, feeding on every retelling, just as a vampire feeds on blood. Elizabeth Báthory's story does not end with her death in 1614, nor with her burial in an unmarked grave. In truth, her story never ended at all. It simply transformed. To some, she remains history's most prolific murderess, a woman responsible for the deaths of scores, perhaps hundreds, of young girls. To others, she was the victim of a political conspiracy, a wealthy, independent noblewoman whose enemies used fear, superstition, and rumor to destroy her legacy and seize her lands. But in the end, the truth matters less than what she became. Elizabeth Báthory transcended history. She became a myth. Her name lingers not in the records of the Hungarian nobility, but in the pages of horror novels, in whispered campfire stories, in the imagination of filmmakers and Gothic writers. She is the Blood Countess, the female Dracula, the immortal symbol of vanity, cruelty, and power corrupted. And yet hidden within the legend is a warning. Her tale reminds us how easily truth can be twisted into propaganda. How power and politics can shape memory. How fear of women with influence, independence, and authority has often led to their demonization. Whether Elizabeth was truly guilty or the victim of exaggeration, history chose to remember her not as a woman, but as a monster. And monsters, once born, never die. So tonight, as you close your eyes, ask yourself, what is the legacy of Elizabeth Báthory? Is it the crimes she was accused of? The myths written centuries later? Or is it the reflection she forces us to see, of a world where truth and horror are often the same face, glimpsed from different angles of shadow and light? Elizabeth's blood has dried, but her story still flows dark and unending. And now I leave you with this. What do you believe? Was she a countess, a killer, or the world's first immortal vampire? If this story pulled you into the shadows of history, then share it, follow, and join me next time as we uncover another tale where truth and legend bleed into one.